Great, thank you. So again, I'm Caroline Mellor, statewide drought lead with Department of Ecology, and we're here for our March Water Supply Availability Committee meeting, or WASAC. And recording now for the presentation portion, then we'll stop for our discussions. And for our agenda here today, we're going to start off with Karen from the Washington State Climate Office on the regional larger picture updates. And then I didn't have a chance to update this, but I know Mick with Borough Reclamation did have a schedule change, so he's going to go second with some important updates from Reclamation on the Yakima project, especially coming out of their briefing last Thursday. And then we'll have Matt with NRCS on mountain conditions, Nick with USGS on stream flow and groundwater. We will be doing Mick second. And then closing out with Robin, who's kindly subbing in for Amy Burke. Robin coming in from the National Weather Service on water supply forecasts. And then today, we will be having a discussion on that hydrologic threshold question, and I'll touch on what that means again, which is an important part of Washington State's drought declaration process. And then we'll have time for everyone to join the discussion at the end. And again, WASAC provides an important role to ecology, advising on current and forecasted water supply conditions, as well as part of our drought declaration process, and advising when our hydrologic threshold for drought conditions has been met or is likely to be met in a portion or all of the state. And for today, we're having our overall assessment of water conditions here in March, and then again, discussing if drought conditions warrant WASAC recommending to ecology to convene the next steps in our state's drought declaration process. And I'll touch later on what that means. And again, as a recap, back in April of last year, ecology declared an essentially statewide drought due to low snowpack and a warm and dry forecast. And we saw the majority of that come true. There were a few places last summer, like that mid-August storm, when things could have turned a lot worse. And again, last year, there were exceptions in the declaration for just the areas served by the utilities of Everett, Seattle, and Tacoma, as they had healthy storage from their reservoir system. Now, this does expire April 15th of April next month, and that's where some questions come into play at this point in time, particularly for the Yakima area, and that's where Mick's presentation will be particularly helpful, as well as everyone else's perspective on water supply conditions going forward for that April to September period. And when I talk about our hydrologic threshold, that's because for the state of Washington, we have drought conditions in statute, and that means two things. First, this hydrologic threshold that an area is receiving or projected to receive less than 75% of normal water supply. And when we say normal, that's referring to the climate normals, our 30-year base averages, which right now is from 1991 to 2020. So talking about a normal means compared to the average of that 30-year period for this point in history. So for March or for March 13th. And then second, we have a hardship threshold that water users and the environment are expected to experience undue hardship from these drought conditions. And again, this committee advises ecology on the hydrologic threshold portion. And when we say water supply, that means a lot of different things. That can include snowpack, precipitation, temperature, soil moisture, both the water year to date and forecast numbers for all of the above. And looking at different factors, that's where we met that hydrologic threshold condition last April. And now come again, we're looking at these water supply factors for potentially recommending to convene the process to extend the drought declaration for a portion of the state, with the Yakima basins being where we're particularly concerned at this point in time, but still concerned for other areas for later in the summer and potentially later in spring. And in terms of a drought declaration here in Washington, that means two main things. The ecology can expedite the processing of emergency water transfer applications. And I always like to know all the other requirements, including mitigation, are still in place. Just means we can process in 15 days instead of months or years. And second, that we can open up specific grant funding to support public entities to address the hardships they're facing from these current drought conditions. And that includes for tribes, cities, counties, water, sewer, utility, irrigation, conservation districts, as well as under a drought declaration, Ecology can use drought response funds to support other state agencies to respond to drought in ways they're uniquely positioned to do, and can open up eligibility for some federal funding and serves as an important communication tool for water users what may come to be this year or what folks are experiencing and how best to prepare for that, as well as understanding about ongoing patterns we're seeing with drought. And for the Yakima region, if there's drought this year, that we're seeing high concerns with what's going on in the reservoir system, that would be the third back-to-back-to-back drought year for the Yakima basins. And for example, drought projects, this can include for agriculture, purchasing or leasing of water from other water right holders. This past summer in 2024, we did see an irrigation district lease water from a water bank in another irrigation district, as well as with public water supply systems. That can include the transportation of emergency water supplies. And in 2023, we did have a grant supporting the transporting of water supplies out on the Olympic Peninsula, where a surface water stream can dry up sooner when it otherwise would not in drought years. And with fisheries and wildlife, it can be supporting DFW to address issues that come up differently in drought years. For instance, the creation of migration barriers that folks do in rivers and streams recreationally, but impede fish passage. And I do want to note that right now, these grants are still open, again, for the areas in the state, essentially most of the state declared in 2024. And this is open for the next couple of weeks. However, again, for any grants to come in over the next couple of weeks, it must be to address continued water supply issues from 2024 conditions. And now at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Karen for our first presentation. And we'll have our presentations, and then we will come back around to the hydrologic threshold question. And particularly for the Yakima basins, but may also look at some other areas for advisory status. And with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and pass it over to you, Karen. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Does that look okay?
Fantastic.
All right. Thanks a lot, Caroline. Again, my name's Karen Bumbaco. I'm with the Washington State Climate Office at the University of Washington. I'm going to dive right in. This is looking at our water year to date, temperature on the left-hand side, precipitation on the right. So we've had some cooler temperatures recently. So this is a bit of a shift from what I've presented in previous WASACs. Our temperatures are not quite as warm for the water year as they had been, with those cool temperatures kind of balancing out some of the earlier warmth we've seen. Looking across the state as a whole from October to February, it's slightly above normal, near normal for the state there, with some areas still a little bit on the warmer side. For precipitation, this has been looking pretty similar, month after month here. We're seeing below normal precipitation in Western Washington and up to and including the Cascade Mountains and the East Slopes, and then above normal precipitation or near normal precipitation on the east side. So if you average it across the state, it's more tipped towards the below normal side at about 93% of normal precipitation from October to February. Ranks about the 49th driest when we're looking at 130 years. All right, so here's February. Like I said, some really cold temperatures. We had a couple weeks of a cold snap earlier in the month, and temperatures were running below normal. Average statewide, it's still not that anomalous compared to the whole record. It tied as the 28th coldest on record, going back to 1895. And that year that it tied was 1904. So no memories of that with this group. Average statewide precipitation was above normal. That was largely driven by this above normal precipitation in southeastern Washington across most of eastern Washington, near normal to above for the rest of the state. All right, so I showed this last time. This is as of March 1st, and what it's doing is it's telling you the odds that we will reach 100% normal precipitation by the end of the water year based on how much precipitation has been observed through March 1st, and then how much has historically been observed during the remaining months of the year. So for, these parts of Western Washington and the Cascade Mountains, particularly here through the Northern Cascades, Central Cascades, this is, less than a 10% chance that we're going to make up being back to normal precipitation. Not really surprising. Our wettest months climatologically have passed already. The blues here in Eastern Washington are just because there were already normal or above for the water year. So that won't change even if we're dry from here on out. I pulled these graphs. They're a little different in the sense that they're only showing us the areas that have less than 75% of normal precipitation. And I chose this because of our Washington state statute with 75% of water supply being part of that hydrologic threshold. So we could consider precipitation to be that. On the left-hand side here, this is looking from the start of the water year to, just a couple days ago, March 9th. And we're only seeing some small areas of kind of brownish tan pop-ups that have had less than 75% of normal precipitation for the water year, notably in our mountainous areas. If we look from since January to March 9th, we get a much larger part of the state. A reminder how exceptionally dry January was. It tied as the fifth driest across Washington state on record. So we really can see much wider, including the Olympic Peninsula, all of Western Washington up into the Okanagan. This has all been less than 75% of normal precipitation since January 1st. This is a drought defined by the Palmer Hydrologic Drought Index. So this is a index that it's just one drought indicator. So it's not saying, drought as defined by the state of Washington or anything else. It's one particular indicator that tends to show more long-term drought. But the NOAA National Center for Environmental Information has this neat tool where you can see how much precipitation would you need to kind of ameliorate drought conditions in a certain amount of time. So I picked 3 months, just, through our spring when we tend to get more precipitation compared to summer. And there's a choice to either ameliorate, so you're lessening how the drought looks, versus completely improve, get rid of drought entirely, end drought entirely. So to make things better, that's sort of obvious. We need more precipitation than normal in those 3 months. These numbers for the Puget Sound lowlands and the West kind of climate division, I don't think those are unreachable. That's something that we can certainly see in 3 months when you're starting to get to 120 to 140% of normal precipitation. That seems very unlikely in that short amount of time. If we were to look at this in terms of ending any signature of drought, we would need more like 150 to 200% of normal precipitation for all of Western Washington, including this coastal climate division that didn't show up in this one. Okay, so I showed these last time, and I just wanted to show them quickly again. This is for Stampede Pass. Snow water equivalent is here on our y-axis. And then precipitation is on, our x-axis here, and it's goes by time. So February, oh, I forgot to update the legend. Sorry, the yellow should now be March. So here we are, just as of March, this sort of yellow dot showing that we are officially what would be called a snow drought for this particular station, where we have snowpack about 63% of median, and similar about 63% of precipitation. So it's a low precipitation, snow-driven snow drought in the Stampede Pass. And Matt, you're probably going to show these, but I just wanted to tie them to the snow drought tracker. NRCS has this great product where this is our current trace of snowpack at Stampede Pass. And then it's using the historical record to sort of project out what could possibly happen. So this green line here is if we get normal snow from here on out, and we're still well below our normal snow for Stampede Pass. So very unlikely that we will improve to kind of this normal snowpack that we would expect in any given year. We would need much, much above normal snowpack here, this blue line. Same thing for Hearts Past. So very similar, not really any change from February. This is March, this kind of yellow dot. So still below normal snowpack, below normal precipitation there. So a low precipitation snowpack drought driven up at Hearts Pass. Um, Same thing for these projection plots. Here's this normal line here, and it's still much below what we would expect to have by our peak snowpack. Okay, so Drought Monitor, this was released just this morning, still representative of really the overall dryness since January 1st that we've seen more west of the Cascades and including the Cascades. Very minor changes since we last met, some worsening in terms of this area of moderate drought and a little bit of improvement on the Olympic Peninsula because of some recent precipitation. One thing to note here is our station at Quileute. The precipitation gauge looks like it's having some problems. So there's sort of a false dry signal here at Quileute. So the National Weather Service is looking into it, and hopefully it can be fixed and back up and running. But I would view any record from the Quileute station out on the coast with suspicion since about January. La Nina is still here, but it's already showing signs of weakening. So this is our sea surface temperature anomalies. We're starting to see some warming in the eastern tropical Pacific and central. That is new since last time. Atmospheric signals still showing La Nina, but also signs of weakening. In terms of the probabilities moving forward, we're now entering the phase where it's more likely than not that we'll transition to neutral conditions. It's not a huge factor in our weather right now. Typically, the phase of ENSO doesn't matter as much in the summertime in terms of what happens in our weather. So this shift to neutral is not a big player. What it can do is impact our spring weather a bit. And I'll show in the forecasts that some of those forecasts have recently changed with the expectation that La Nina will weaken soon. But before I get to that, this weekend we're expecting to see some snow in the mountains, rain in the lowlands, which is good news. Kind of 6 to 10 days out, so into next week. This is valid March 18th through 22nd. We're also expecting to kind of remain cool and wet, which is also good. But really beyond that, we're not seeing a lot of evidence that this will persist into later March. And then looking at the Climate Prediction Center outlook for April through June, so the 3-month period, it's not really an indication either way in terms of how our temperatures will compare to average or our precipitation. And then once we shift into our summer periods, these maps change to show a higher probability of above normal temperatures and below normal precipitation for all of Washington. And that sort of sticks around through a lot of the summer periods. I'm anxiously awaiting the update to this forecast. This was issued in February 20th, so I think it's next week that the update will come out, because looking at some of the seasonal forecast models, this is again shifting towards warmer. So this is the average of all these individual thumbnails down here showing a higher probability of above normal temperatures for April through June, pretty consistent along these thumbnails, maybe save for this one. And then this is the International Multi-Model Ensemble, so a different set of seasonal forecast models that agrees with more likely to be warm. So I'm anxious to see if the CPC will kind of shift towards maybe warmer temperatures sooner than later on in the summer. Same for precipitation. Kind of the ensemble here is like near normal for Western Washington, a little bit drier in Eastern Washington. And these thumbnails mostly align, except again for this one model that is a little bit different than everyone else. The International Multi-Model Ensemble, maybe some near normal to drier in the southern part of Washington. So some indications that we could be really shifting out of what we've been talking about with our La Nina signal and expecting cool and wet. Okay, so to summarize, water year temperatures have been near normal. The precipitation has been below normal for Western Washington. Important that it includes the Cascade Mountains, most of the east slopes of the Cascade Mountains, but above normal precipitation across Eastern Washington. January was extremely dry. February was cool, tied as the 28th coldest, with some above normal precipitation overall as the state, but it was really driven by kind of southeastern Washington, above normal precipitation. Our La Nina is weakening. We do expect like the next week and a half should be cooler and wetter. So some snowpack being built then. But after that, there's little indication that we'll see sort of a late spring bailout in terms of snow. There are, historical marches that have and even April that has dropped a ton of snow in the mountains, and we're not really expecting to see that this year. And with that, I'll close.
Great. Thank you, Karen. I really appreciate those different perspectives that you brought in, comparing so the historical pieces and where we are now. And before we go over to Mick, I just want to highlight for Washington that we had a drought declaration in 2023 for 12 watersheds and parts of 12 counties. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning here, in 2024, there's essentially statewide. And so again, that's where with the Yakima basins, that's one of the areas that was hardest hit with water supply impacts in the last 2 years, and could be potentially looking at a third year of triple back-to-back-to-back drought. And we're already hearing concerns from irrigators and folks concerned about fish populations and fish health, and overall definite concern that we're hearing from folks in the Yakima communities and all of those basins. Just kind of wanted to highlight that before jumping over to Mick in terms of sort of what we're hearing and kind of that historical piece the last couple of years. And so with that, Michelle, can you pull up the screen share for Mick's slides, please? Great.
So the next one,
Thank you.
please. So the first slide is presenting a situation at the Yakima airport. So the same situation as it was described before. Temperatures in February were kind of on the colder side or normal. And precipitation looks actually in Yakima quite good. It's way above average. However, it doesn't reflect what's happening in the entire basin. Could we go to the next slide? Looking at the precipitation for the Yakima Basin. So it's the compilation of the precipitation as measured at 5 Yakima reservoirs. It was only 76.5% of average. February was slightly above average, about 105.6, but beginning of the water year definitely, except of December, was significantly below average, and January was only around 35%. Next slide, please. Looking at the snowpacks, February had only 78%, January 82%. So basically entire water year is significantly below average. As Bureau of Reclamation measured, it was 78% at our stations, compared to NRCS with Upper Yakima at 87, Natchez close to normal, and Lower Yakima at 83%. The difference is because we measure different stations. Next slide, please. Unregulated flow at Yakima. So basically, it represents all the inflows to 5 reservoirs. It's only 53% of average. There was some spike at the end of the month of February. We can see it on the chart, but the situation looks really bad, and it reflects low groundwater level. So groundwater is depleted, and streams are receiving only half of inflow, which they usually do at this time of year. Next slide, please. Next slide is presenting what we are releasing and measured flows for the system. So basically, we are releasing around, for the water year, around 70% of average, but all the reservoirs are releasing required minimum flows. The next slide, please. So the next slide is presenting the same situation, but measured at Parker. Again, unregulated flows are only at 51% of normal. The next slide. And 55% of normal for the regulated or measured flow at Parker. Next slide, please. And to make situation worse, we finished the last water year with historically low content of the reservoirs. And as of now, we have third lowest measured storage in reservoirs as measured from 1971. We are only at 36% of average, and with the snowpack and precipitation, it looks really not very optimistic. Next slide, please. Some comparison to other years. So we are resembling 1987, 93, 94. But as I mentioned, we are third lowest. And I think it's the no, there's one more slide. Could we switch to the next slide? There's two more. The next slide is presenting forecasts, which we were providing on March 8th. This forecast already have dropped, and the forecasts are basically seem to be on the too optimistic side. So we are, or I'm suspecting that the situation will get worse. At Parker, which is the station a little bit downstream from Yakima, the average forecast is 85% of normal, with the reservoirs basically Ketchilas and Cliolum in the mid to upper 80s, and Bumping Rimrock close to normal, around 95-97%. And the reservoirs as of now, Cliolum, Ketchis, and Ketchilas have no chance to fill up. Bumping will fill, and possibly Rimrock. The next slide, please. So the next slide, I think it's the last slide, it's presenting total water supply available for irrigators. And the most important part of the slide is that junior users, based on the forecast and the storage in the reservoirs, will receive 48% of the water which they are entitled to, and the range is between 20 and 78%. And the forecast is dropping. So that's all what I have.
Thank you, Mick. And actually, Michelle, could you just leave that slide up for just a moment here? Since Mick has to leave early, I just want to pause on here on that slide, and we can pull it up again later on if we need to. Yeah, Michelle, can you bring up that slide for just a moment, that last one? Great, thank you. And Mick, I just want to highlight for folks here that may not follow Yakima operations as much as some folks do, that in terms of that total water supply estimate, why that 48% is so important and so concerning. And that while other basins just have senior and junior users, that Yakima has folks in this pro-ratable category. And so, while we talk about for drought, we're meaning drought conditions if it's below 75% of normal. And while just looking at those snowpack numbers, things might look a little better with that 48% forecast for how much water folks will receive. And with what you're saying, that itself might even start going down. I just want to sort of maybe hear a little bit more from you and just highlight for folks sort of what that 48% actually means for folks on the ground in terms of water supply.
So basically we have in Yakima Basin senior users and junior users which are prorated. So here we have, for example, non-proratable entitlements. So these are senior users and proratable entitlements. So it's another column here. So and the supply is a composition of natural flow, some return flows estimates from the irrigation, and the content of the reservoir. So if we do the math, the proratable users will get less than half of entitlement, and usually if it's less than 90, maybe 85%, it starts to hurt them.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and so just highlighting for folks that with these compounding deficits, I think Matt's going to highlight some more of this as well. Just kind of understanding this broader picture that's after these back-to-back droughts in 23 and 24, there were snowpack-driven droughts, particularly for the Yakima Basin. Now that's really impacted reservoir storage. And so as Mick said, reservoir storage is now at the third lowest since 1971. And even though that there is not horrible snowpack this year, there would have needed that way above normal precipitation and snowpack like Karen mentioned. So yeah, so just highlighting here for folks that this 48% adopted number you see in that middle column, yeah, you can highlight that 48%. Just highlighting for folks that with the Yakima system, that it's different than other parts of the state. And that 48% is what's highly concerning for ecology and what's really driving having this hydrologic threshold discussion here, since that then puts water supply in water users way below normal for much of the Yakima basins. Mick, just one last follow-up question, since you have to leave early. Anything else you can add to these, the impacts of back-to-back droughts in 23 and 24 and what that has meant for reservoir storage?
So the situation doesn't look good. We have very low inflows. Of course, there is snow and temperature has dropped, which is very good for us. But again, forecast is calling for warm temperature after I think it's 6 to 8 days, or I forgot which range of the forecast was presented. But Yakima is very specific. So we have about 1 million acre-feet of storage in the 5 reservoirs combined. But but the watershed is using around 2 million acre-feet of water. So usually another million of acre-feet is supplied from the snow and natural flow. So with such a low base flows and snowpack, which potentially may melt, we have so empty reservoirs that there is a high chance that we'll capture the melting snow, but it would force us to go on storage control. So storage control is the moment in the water year when we start to supply base flows with releases from the reservoir. So basically we don't get enough natural supply of the water since then, and if snow melts early, it will make situation even worse.
Great. Thank you, Mick. Does anyone else have any other quick questions for Mick before we go to Matt? Great. Thank you. And Mick, last thing for you is just highlighting again for our process, since we'll be looking at this question, I think, more formally after you have to go. And would you agree or have any questions around the fact that 48% a pro-ratable amount would put water users that are pro-ratable water users below that 75% threshold for water supply? Does that
Definitely, it's a big hardship for them.
Great. Thank you for that. Yeah, I appreciate the time here. So with that, we'll go over to Matt with NRCS. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And I will chew up that extra 2.5 minutes. There we are. So as Caroline stated, my name is Matt Warburton. I'm the supervisory hydrologist with the Snow Survey Program here in the Northwest region. We'll jump right in. Don't want to waste any time. There's plenty of slides to show. Moving right into snowpack conditions statewide with regard to the SNOTEL network. Snowpack is at 85% of normal or 76% of medium peak snowpack. The typical timing for peak snowpack statewide is early April, so we're approaching that point and still have a good amount of ground to make up. So certainly this next storm cycle will help, but it likely won't be enough to really boost snowpack statewide to near normal peak. Taking a look at snowpack conditions across the Columbia Basin, so giving a pretty broad look of the region before we zoom in a bit. Looking first at the map on the right, showing mostly below normal snowpack conditions in most of the basins that are on the screen. So Upper Columbia, Puget, Pend Oreille, Spokane, and the Yakima Basin. And then if we start to divide those basins up, looking at the map on the left here into smaller sub-basins, we can see, and my point in showing this is the variability in snowpack conditions, particularly in the Upper Columbia Basin, in north central Washington and into British Columbia, but also in the Pend Oreille and Spokane basins as well, which all feed into the Columbia River. So snowpack in these areas are ranging from slightly below to near normal, and conditions sort of beyond the Washington state boundaries has implications for water supply within the state. So I just wanted to show that. And then also the sub-basin map is showing the below normal snowpack conditions pretty well in much of the central and northern Cascades in Washington. All right, now zooming in and just focusing in on Washington. So looking at March 1 conditions on the right, March 11th conditions on the left. The reason why I'm showing March 1 conditions is because we're showing our snow course data across all these major basins. And I think it highlights really well some of the elevational variability that we're seeing in snowpack this season, where low elevation snowpack across much of the Cascades is quite poor. In the North Puget Sound Basin, these red squares are mostly snow courses that are below about 3,200 feet. Similarly, with those squares in the Central and South Puget Sound Basins, they're typically lower elevation sites where snow is manually measured. And we're seeing just extremely poor snow conditions. And similar with the Olympic Peninsula, snow conditions are quite poor at the lower elevations in the northern part of the basin. And compare that to the upper Columbia, where snowpack is generally doing quite well, at least in the Washington portion of that basin, ranging from near to above normal, even at lower elevation sites. Another area just to point out some of that variability is the Spokane Basin. So looking near just northeast of Spokane, seeing quite a bit of variability, more robust snowpack at higher elevations and quite poor snowpack at lower elevations. And sort of these March 1 conditions are generally similar to March 11th conditions. I'm just showing March 11th because that's when we've had the most recent quality control of our data that I'm looking at. Snowpack, pretty similar picture to last month and in March 1 as well. So just mainly below normal conditions across the state, with some better snowpack in the southern portions, the Cascades in Washington, and also in the Blue Mountains. One thing to note, I want to point out is Park Creek Ridge Snow Toe, which is right here where my cursor is on the March 11th map. That's showing moderately below normal snowpack. But based on ground truth measurements that our surveyors have done over the course of this year, this is under measuring snowpack, and we believe part of the pillow is probably flat or depleted in fluid. So when looking at this, just keep that in mind. Snowpack is likely more in that yellow range, so 70 probably to 75% as opposed to in the 60s. All right. So again, just touching on the March 1 conditions, showing snowpack as percentiles, just sort of looking at the areas with considerably low snowpack. Those stand out quite a bit more when we just sort of rank the current snowpack values, so the March 1 values, against that 30-year period. Just incredibly low snowpack in the North Cascades, in addition to the Central Washington Cascades as well, with some of those sites setting records or near record low snowpack for this time of year, I guess March 1, sorry. So red is record low and orange is second record low. However, if you go over to the Columbia Basin, a couple of our snow courses have measured near second, it's the second highest snowpack on record. So a little bit of good news there. All right, moving on to precipitation conditions. Statewide, water year-to-date precipitation is at 85% of normal. Looking at this plot, the black line is the current water year, which started in October 1, 2024. It's the black line, and this kind of burnt orange line is last water year's trend, and the green is the normal trend or the median. Doing a little bit worse, but we're kind of trading places with 2024 as we progressed throughout the season so far. And as of now, we are a little bit worse off than last year in terms of statewide water year to date precipitation. Taking a quick look at month-to-date precipitation, as Karen stated, February was near to slightly above normal in terms of precipitation. And so far, month-to-date, precipitation has been fairly poor, but do expect that to improve with this next storm cycle. Taking a look at water year-to-date precipitation across the major basins, most of these basins are in a water year-to-date precipitation deficit, with the exception of the lower Snake and Walla Walla basins, as well as the lower Columbia Basin there in the southern Washington Cascades. And this is showing water year 2025 on the upper right compared to water year 2024 in the lower left here. Just showing the differences and kind of highlighting poor water year to date precipitation conditions compared to last year, notably in the Central Cascades, as well as in part of the Northern Cascades, but a lot of the similar sort of precipitation so far in the North Puget Sound this year. The area I would say that stands out the most is the Central Cascades. In addition to the Lower Columbia, we have seen more favorable impacts in this region this year. However, last year, just a bit more favorable impacts in terms of overall precipitation. All right, so catching up to normal water year to date precipitation. This is showing the normal median departure since the beginning of the water year until now. And this is, you can view it as how much precipitation is needed to get back to normal. And, you know, looking at the Central Cascades, just plucking out one of the values, 20.5 and 20.5 inches. So that's a lot of precipitation to make up as we go through the rest of this winter and early spring. So Karen showed that map with likelihood of getting to 100% water year to date precipitation. So fairly unlikely across the Central and Northern Cascades to just almost not likely at all. So pretty big deficits running up there for the water year. Now taking a look at compounding precipitation deficits and what impacts this has on water supply and reservoir storage. And in particular, so showing first the Yakima Basin. This plot is showing the last decade precipitation sort of accumulated over the last decade, and the y-axis is the amount of precip. And what this shows is a running deficit really since water year about 2023 up until now, with that deficit increasing up to this point. And also we can see another short-term deficit across water year 2019 and into water year 2021, with a slight reprieve about a year and a half, 2 years before we entered into this most recent deficit. So this is a region that has experienced a deficit in the recent past and is currently in a deficit. And this is, I think, it's definitely most evident by the reservoir storage volumes. I mean, we can look at in the upper Yakima, and this Mick noted this already, our storage volumes are just incredibly low. And that's in large part due to compounding moisture deficits, and not necessarily just from either current or last year's below normal precip and snowpack conditions. Now taking a look at the Methow and Chelan basins, again, just showing a precipitation deficit. This time that started more last year and has persisted and grown as we've gone through this water year with no signs yet of really any recovery in these areas. And now looking at North Puget Sound, I'm showing these basins because these basins are areas where we're seeing incredibly low snowpack. We've been seeing incredibly low snowpack since last water year, and also water year to date precipitation deficits. And we can see in the greater North Puget Sound basin, again, a deficit emerging in water year 2024 and increasing as we proceed through this water year. And then finally, just showing a basin in the Central Cascades on the west side, Cedar Basin, really a pretty significant deficit that's growing in this basin that started in water year 2023, and again has increased through this water year with no sign yet of any recovery. So a pretty substantial deficit that's growing in that basin. And it's important to note that for this basin, you know, precipitation overall is incredibly important. Whereas when we talk about the Yakima Basin, snowpack is a lot more important for that basin because it's more of a snowpack driven runoff basin, whereas this basin is more rain dominated. So that precipitation component is incredibly important. important for this basin and other adjacent basins in the western part of the state. Taking a look at soil moisture here. I'll try to leave some room for questions at the end, but comparing just two products to see where there are some similarities, and we can see some indications of very dry soil moisture conditions across much of the northern parts of the Cascades, parts of the sort of eastern front of the Central Cascades, thinking, Lake Chelan area, and in portions of the Yakima Basin, some agreement in terms of dry soil moisture conditions. Also some agreement between these two products with drier conditions in the very northeastern part of the state in the lower Pend Oreille Basin. All right, water supply outlook. The NRCS water supply outlook that was released on March 1. Across the southern portions of the state, the water supply outlook is fairly near normal. And as we progress northward up into the North Cascades and even the upper Columbia, water supply forecasts deteriorate to more below normal. On the peninsula, the water supply outlook is near normal. And I should note too, the map on the left is showing percent of normal, which is just the median. And then on the right is the showing a percentile. So just comparing these water supply forecasts and where it ranks with other forecasts within that 30-year period. And this helps us, I think, see the lower forecasts a bit better. It's highlighting parts where we are seeing just over that 30-year period, a pretty low forecast for this year's March 1 release. We can see a couple red dots across the Columbia and also orange dots looking on the map on the right here in the Lake Chelan Basin and in the North Puget Sound Basin. So some low water supply forecasts in those regions. And just briefly touching on looking ahead, there is a pretty active storm cycle that will be impacting the region. Unfortunately, the snow forecast for the Washington Cascades has been tempered a bit over the last couple days, but still expect to see some, I would say, significant snow accumulation across the Cascades and also north central and going eastward near the Idaho border, some additional snow accumulation there. Like with many other storm tracks so far this season, the favorable area is the southern Oregon and northern California coast. So once again, that area will receive more favorable impacts than other parts of the coast, especially along Washington, but still expect to see some pretty significant snow and precip accumulation across the state. And that's all I have.
Great. Thank you very much, Matt. Yeah, very appreciate the extra slides around compounding deficits and some of those comparisons. Any quick questions for Matt before we go to Nick? Great. Well, Matt, I appreciate you being able to stay on for a little discussion after the next two presentations. And with that, we'll go to Nick. Thank you.
All right. Hello. Good morning, everyone. Can you see my slides and hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Great. I got a picture here from Bolt Creek, our post-wildfire study that we're wrapping up the end of this month, but out in the snow collecting samples. Trying to be productive. I should also mention, I guess I'm Nick Sutphin. I'm a hydrologist and the surface water specialist for the USGS Washington Water Science Center in Tacoma. I'll start here with the typical 7-day average stream flow that we look at across the state. Generally speaking, around normal or below normal conditions, seeing most of those below normal or much below normal conditions around the South Puget Sound area, starting from Seattle down past Olympia. We'll look at there might be a little bit of a delay, so I'll try to trigger earlier so that you can kind of be caught up. And please let me know if there's any issues with the slides. We have kind of limited bandwidth with everyone back in the office now. So we'll look at these typical 8 stream gauges that we use as index gauges, where these exhibit relatively or near natural stream flow conditions. Looking at those, we see similar trend, such that most of these gauges are normal, primarily in the northwest and southeastern portion of the state. The American River east of Mount Rainier is flowing above normal, and we have some below normal conditions in the East Fork Lewis River and Chehalis River. Looking again at the 7-day average, but now across the state for as of March 12th, yesterday, we see most of the state is in that green normal conditions. And again, this is area weighted averages of our USGS stream gauges within these hydrologic unit boundaries. We do have some below normal conditions around the South Sound down toward the Chehalis, and then up in the North Cascades, some below and much below normal conditions over in the northeast and southeast part of the state. And if we then zoom out a bit further, using also the 7-day average, but now looking 45 days back, starting toward the end of January. It's typical plot I show where this vertical axis shows the percentage of USGS stream gauges. We typically look at this 50% of gauges come out to present day to see if most of our gauges are flowing normal, above or below. It's showing that most of our gauges are flowing at normal conditions. There's a lot of significant flow, at least, not many of them flowing below normal. The plot on the right is similar, but instead of showing the percentage of gauges, it's showing an average stream flow index. So you could see that we were below normal through the 2 first months of the year, really. Indicated also in the left plot here, showing that most of our gauges were flowing below or much below normal. We then had, toward the end of March, that increase that brought us above stream flow, the stream flow index, the normal, and now we kind of are dipping back down just below normal. Now looking at the monthly average stream flow, February here, we got a full summary of February, and I wasn't able to join you all in January. I have that here on the left. Both of them showing, kind of mixed, about half normal to below or much below normal conditions. We did have an increase toward normal conditions in February compared to January. And that's likely from those, late February rains and precipitation that we started to get. I jump now to this next slide that compares this February to last year. So kind of quite a bit different, still a lot of green, a lot of normal stream flow conditions for the month in last year, but kind of a lot more disparate. We had a number of basins that are above or much above and below and much below normal. This year showing quite a bit more of, below normal conditions. Now, again, looking at the 7-day average runoff duration hydrograph showing going back a few years, we see now that we're sitting at about normal conditions. This black line is showing the current conditions, whereas the colors in the background showing the same percentile classes that we've been looking at with the other plots. So we're in normal. We kind of had that rise above normal briefly. And before that, we were in quite dry conditions. Excuse me. So but we can compare that to the prior years where we had potentially some similar peaks that bring us above normal that looked like they had occurred a little bit earlier than they did this year, but they had dropped quite rapidly toward below normal conditions. So yeah, we'll see with those predictions of precipitation and the lack of snowpack. I'm not sure we'll be climbing back out of that too much. But we'll look now. I typically show this slide that shows 4 different significant drought years, comparing that to this year. Again, seeing that now we're in this normal condition going into some of these past droughts, like 2019, for example, we were much below normal at this time. Same thing with 2005, 2001, and even 2015. So as far as the 7-day average stream flow, this time of year, we're a little better than going into those drought years. So then again, now looking at the area-based, area-weighted flow across the state, looking at February in these drought years as well. We could see, I guess, some similarities with maybe 2019 with regard to just spatial variability of normal versus below normal conditions. But we do have a bit more normal conditions this year than in 2019. Definitely not as much red as the 2001, 2005 drought years. February 2015, a bit different, I think, of a drought mechanism that year, but there was a lot more above normal conditions in February. And that really, a lot of that, again, it can be related to snowpack and snow melt. And if we have early snow melt, that can bring up those stream flows and actually, and result in potential drought. So then now where does that put us? Long-term, the cumulative hydrograph for the water year, 2025 on the right here, the black line being current year, blue being the highest cumulative runoff observed, the orange being the lowest. So we are in the normal range, kind of right in just below the middle there. Comparing that to last year, around March, we were just above the middle of that normal range. So yeah, not any distinct divergence from normal with regard to cumulative runoff. Excuse me. So now we'll switch to groundwater. I'm looking at these 2 wells that we now use for reference groundwater wells with long-term records, the Davenport well and the Whetstone well. Davenport well here, looking back for the year, the dark blue line being the groundwater elevation or depth of groundwater. Presently, this dotted gray line on the top is the median, and that kind of tan light line at the bottom is last year. So present time, we are sitting above last year's current levels and below the median. Zooming out a bit further, looking back to about 2016, where we had a big depletion in this groundwater well, and after that 2015 drought, we had that recharge event, and it's taken several years to come back down. Looks like we might be on a slow rising trend, despite kind of the deficits and and snowpack as we just saw, and over the last few years. But I guess we'll have to see how that responds. Then looking at the Whetstone well, same plot. That the little dots here of the median are a little sparse, difficult to see. But in the end, right now we are sitting below both last year and median conditions at the Whetstone well. Moving out to a bit larger time span, going back to 2022. we can see that the groundwater conditions here are pretty low compared to these last handful of years, but you know, on a rising trend presently. And then looking at these plots, so where does that put us with regard to historical percentiles? These colors indicating those same classes that we've been looking at with stream flow. The Davenport well, we've come up into normal conditions where we were below normal in February. And the Whetstone well, we had come out of much below normal conditions to normal conditions there. And in summary, 7-day average stream flow at the 8 index gauges. We have most of them being in normal flow conditions. The American River being above normal. I'm sorry, this one should be normal, not above normal. This top bullet, sorry about that. And then below normal conditions at Chehalis and the East Fork Lewis. The cumulative runoff hydrograph for 2025 is currently at normal. And then the monthly average groundwater conditions at Davenport are normal and at Whetstone are below normal. And that's what I've got, and take any questions if anyone has them.
Great. Thank you, Nick. Any quick questions for Nick before we move on to Robin? Great. Thank you. Robin, over to you, and you should be able to screen share for yourself.
All right, great, thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Robin Fox. I'm with the National Weather Service, and I'm out of the Spokane office. I'm filling in for Amy, who's unavailable today. But I just want to remind that with the Weather Service, we all work as a team to get the water messages out and forecasts on water supply, along with myself in Spokane, Brent in Seattle, and George in the Pendleton office. So first, let's kind of do a quick review. I know Karen talked a lot about this, and so did Matt, but just kind of a review of the temperatures and the precipitation since last we met. So the charts at the top show the precipitation that we saw in the month of February and since March 1st. So February was quite wet, especially for Southeast Washington and extreme Eastern Washington. And so far, as of actually the first week, 10 days of March, it's been very dry, but we've had this precipitation the last couple days, and that's bumped up some amounts, especially up in north central Washington and down in the south central portion. As for temperatures, yes, February was quite cold, and we can see that region-wide with the temperatures in the lower left image. But for the first start of March, it's been a little bit on the milder side, especially for Eastern Washington. And a lot of that was due to that warm up that we had late in February, and that did eat away some of that snowpack in the lower elevations. So seasonal precipitation, it has varied with above normal to normal condition precipitation across Southeast Washington and the below normal areas across the northern portions of the Cascades. So here is also an image that compares the precipitation with the snowpack, the SWE, and the runoff that we've had as of today. So I know we talked a lot in detail about that snowpack, and that is going to be a key driver as we look at the water supply forecasts. And with the measurements that we're also seeing in the Cascades, it is quite variable with pockets of below normal snowfall and above to near snowfall. The areas that really stand out with above normal snowfall tend to be in that Okanagan Highlands area and also with the Blue Mountains. And as I mentioned, that warming that we received really ate away a lot of that low-level snowpack and into the mid-slopes as well. So most of what we're seeing of that abundance of snow is in the higher elevations. So the runoff that we've seen kind of varies as well. We've seen some increase, especially with the recent precipitation event across portions of Southeast Washington. Unfortunately, North Central Washington still lacks in the way of the runoff. So it was mentioned, the first start of May has been quiet and drier, but we're in for a wetter period. And here is the forecast precipitation amounts that are being factored into the upcoming Weather Service water supply forecast. So remember, the first 10 days of the weather forecast for temperature and precipitation are added into these forecasts. And this is what we're going to be seeing for the next 10 days. So very wet, especially for the west side of the state, with areas in excess of 100% of normal. So we're going to see wet conditions as we go through the weekend and again early next week. And even a hint for the 8 to 14 day outlook still calls for above normal precipitation and below normal temperatures. So hopefully this is going to help raise that snowpack up a little bit more. Some areas that do look like are going to be a little bit below normal for the next 10 days for precipitation tend to look like across the Cascades, both for the upper slopes on the west side and the east slopes down toward the Yakima Basin. So here is a comparison of the runoff that we've seen since the start of the water year on the left, and the water supply forecast that was released and updated today that is on the right. So with the runoff, we can see some areas have perked up across pockets of extreme eastern Washington and also across portions of northwest Washington and near the coast. As for the water supply forecast, it's still trending near to below normal, depending on where you go. But the areas that do still stand out is that pocket of north central Washington in the northern Cascades. So here we can look at a little more of the specifics for the runoff. We can see some areas did see some improvements of runoff over the last month with that wet system that came in late February, that atmospheric river event. The Skagit up in Mount Vernon, that hasn't seen much in the way of changes nor did the Dungeness near Sequim. Still pretty close to normal of little changes that we've seen in the runoff. The Chehalis has seen some increases in runoff, but we see more of those increases for the Yakima at Parker and at Walla Walla as well when we saw all of that precipitation. Now here's the comparison from last month of the water supply forecast from the National Weather Service. Overall, we have seen improvements that over last month, and particularly in some of those drier areas. The Skagit has seen an increase of about 8, Chehalis an increase of about 2. Still seeing on the Dungeness a little bit of a decrease. More than likely, that's driven by the rain. It's more of a rain-driven basin, and not so much of a snowpack one. So we haven't quite seen that one perk up in the last month. But for the Okanagan at Malott and the Methow at Pateros, we've seen a little bit more of those increases, primarily with that snowpack that has bumped up slightly. And also increases for the Walla Walla and the Yakima as well. So I want to also compare the water supply forecast that we are seeing compared to the percentiles. I know that there's some areas that we are concerned about, primarily in the Methow Valley and the Okanagan, which in these percentiles really show up being some drier than normal conditions for the water supply. And right now our current forecasts do track that lower than normal levels. Looking at the Yakima Basin, I know that is also another topic. And I know the snowpack there tends to be a little variable with very sharp gradients, and that would be affecting the water supply forecast there. So we're going to be taking a closer look at that in the weeks to come. But showing those percentiles really kind of highlights those areas of concern that we're going to be looking at in the weeks and months to come. So I just want to summarize things. Yes, February was cold and wet. The first start of March was mild and dry, but we're getting into a wetter pattern right now. The runoff since October 1st has largely been below normal to near normal, with those different pockets that vary across the state. The precipitation forecast for the next 10 days and beyond looks significantly wetter in most areas. And with the cooler pattern, hopefully that's going to help build that snowpack even more. And with the water supply forecast from the Weather Service, we've seen that bump up in a few areas, but still it is running below normal across portions of north central Washington, especially in the Northern Cascades and portions of the Central Cascades and Olympics. So I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Great. Thank you, Robin. I just have one thing to highlight. It's correct that with y'all's forecasts for April through September water supply, that takes observed the next 10 days, and after the next 10 days, it's using normals.
It's using normals, the climatology that we typically see this time of year, correct?
Cool. Thank you. Any other quick questions for Robin? Great. Thank you. Michelle, can you stop the recording?